Los Angeles has many gang stories. This one begins before the conflict, with lineage, geography, and history. The 38th Street Gang stands among the oldest street groups in Los Angeles, tracing its roots back to the early 1920s. Over the decades, as the city expanded, so did the gang's influence. Their name became tied to one of the most publicized legal battles in local history, the Sleepy Lagoon trial of 1942. After Jose Diaz was found unresponsive near a popular hangout, dozens of 38th Street members were arrested under racially charged circumstances. Convictions later overturned, but not before stamping 38th Street into public consciousness. Over time, 38th Street aligned itself with the Sureño umbrella and developed ties to La M.A., the Mexican mafia, especially through taxation and organized narcotics operations. A federal indictment later described 38th Street associates collecting payments from vendors at the Alameda swap meet and channeling profits upward to higher-ranking members. Meanwhile, on the east side of South LA, a separate legacy was forming. The Pueblo del Rio housing project, built in 1941 near 53rd and Alameda, became home to generations of working-class Black and Latino families. Pueblo Bishop Bloods, their name combining the project itself and nearby Bishop Street. Local reporting throughout the 2000s documented how the group maintained a tight, sometimes violent grip on narcotics trade inside the complex. By design, 38th Street and Pueblo del Rio sat side by side, their borders touching, their reputations overlapping. That proximity meant tension was inevitable. And in Los Angeles gang history, proximity always writes the next chapter. By the late 1990s, Los Angeles was still living in the shadow of the crack era. The factories and warehouses along Alameda Street that once kept families afloat were now hollow shells, perfect hideouts, stash spots, and drop zones. And just north of that industrial strip, one of LA's oldest Latino gangs, 38th Street, was expanding its footprint. According to Justice Department filings, USV, 38th Street Gang, 2011, and LAPD South Bureau Gang injunction maps, the gang's primary turf ran north of Vernon Avenue, centered near Long Beach Avenue, Alameda Street, and 38th Street itself, with influence stretching from roughly 24th to 47th Street. For decades, that zone had been their base, an area long known for its mix of industry, old apartments, and open railroad corridors. A few blocks south sat Pueblo del Rio, home of the Pueblo Bishop Bloods, those red-flagged housing projects, bounded by Vernon, Slauson, Alameda, and Central, formed one of the largest blood-controlled zones in South Los Angeles. The Pueblos didn't answer to anyone. They weren't under Mexican mafia taxation, and they didn't move under Sureño authority. They were independent, self-contained, and aggressive about it. That independence was exactly the problem. When the Mexican mafia began enforcing its taxation system in the early 1990s, Latino gangs across LA were ordered to pay rent on drug profits and territory in exchange for protection inside county jails. 38th Street complied. They were part of the Sureño network, but the Pueblos weren't. They were Bloods. So when 38th members began pushing south down Alameda to control distribution points and low-income corners that crossed into Pueblo routes, the Pueblos saw it as disrespect and invasion. What began as a few words over corners turned into a drug debt argument. Detectives later tied the first violent exchanges to small-scale street deals gone bad, narcotics stashed in neutral territory near Hooper Avenue and 56th Street. When one side refused to pay, gunfire followed. By the early 2000s, according to LAPD, South Bureau field reports, and LA Times coverage, August 2010, major gang bust targets Pueblo Bishop Bloods. The feud between the two became one of the most active cross-racial gang wars in South LA. A long-standing Sureño pillar, 38th Street, versus a hardened blood set that refused to bow to anyone. Police officers described it as borderless warfare, a few blocks of difference, a few corners worth of money. That was enough to keep blood on the pavement from Vernon to Slauson for the next 2 decades. April 10th, 2005, East 56th Street, Newton Division. Just after 7 p.m., 3 women and a man named Leandre Jackson stood on the 600 block of East 56th Street when a white sedan crept by. The front passenger's window dropped and gunfire erupted. Leandre was killed instantly. 2 women were wounded. Within days, detectives linked the hit to members of the Pueblo Bishop Bloods, working alongside an Oriental Boys affiliate named Randy Cho. Witness statements and call records confirmed Pueblo members James Smith and Michael Johnson bragged about catching one slipping. Both were later convicted of murder. Significance: one of the first modern-era homicides to officially connect the Pueblo projects to 38th Street territories just north of Vernon Avenue. March 18, 2007, Long Beach Avenue near 43rd Street, a mother named Laura Gonzalez parked in front of her home after work. Moments later, a white Impala and a black Escalade rolled slowly past her car and opened fire. Laura was struck multiple times and died at the scene. A tow yard surveillance camera across the street captured both vehicles fleeing the area. Detectives traced the plates to Pueblo Bishop Blood members Jerry Morales, Jonathan King, and Anthony Delgado. Inside county jail, recorded cell conversations caught them arguing about who had talked to police. Each was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Significance: the case showed how the Pueblo feud spilled beyond project boundaries, and how new surveillance tools finally cut through street silence. March 30th, 2010, Fred Roberts Park, 48th and Honduras Street. It was late morning when George Martinez, a known 38th Street member, stood by the basketball courts talking with friends. A man in a black hoodie approached, pulled a revolver, and opened fire. George collapsed on the pavement. A witness named Antonio Alvarez tailed the shooter's escape route and saw him dart into Pueblo del Rio. Police chased him for 3 blocks before tackling him. During the pursuit, he tossed a .38 caliber handgun that was later recovered. The suspect, William Carter, claimed self-defense, saying George had banged on him first, but prosecutors proved that every route he walked that morning ran through 38th Street territory. Verdict: guilty, 40 years to life. Significance: a rare daylight killing with clear territorial evidence and a recovered weapon that mapped the gang's boundaries. July 13, 2013, party inside Pueblo del Rio projects. That summer night, a 38th Street gunman named Juan Dominguez pulled up to a backyard party inside the Pueblo projects. Without warning, he fired into the crowd, striking 2 people, one fatally. Dominguez denied involvement during initial questioning, but later confessed when confronted with ballistics. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. Significance: a direct act of retaliation inside enemy turf, proof that the generational war between 38th Street and the Pueblos was far from over. In March 2013, the conflict reached federal attention when Anthony Gabriel, a Pueblo Bishop Bloods member, was sentenced to 40 years to life for the killing of Carlos Cornelio, 28. A man ambushed and shot in front of his son outside a South LA home. According to the Los Angeles Times, March 25, 2013, prosecutors described the murder as part of a pattern of violent enforcement meant to preserve Pueblo Bishop control over narcotics sales in the projects. The case tied directly into the larger 2010 FBI and LAPDRI-CO sweep, which targeted dozens of gang leaders in Pueblo del Rio. LA Times, August 26, 2010. The raids seized weapons, drugs, and led to over 70 indictments under the Federal Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Even with those convictions, smaller cliques kept fighting. Proof that federal pressure only scattered the violence rather than ending it. Between 2005 and 2013, police records and court filings attribute more than a dozen verified shootings, 6 homicides, and dozens of assaults to this feud. The rivalry turned the corridor between Hooper Avenue and Central Avenue into a permanent hot zone, forcing law enforcement to flood the projects while 38th Street doubled down north of Vernon. By the time the FBI raids hit, the feud was already generational. When the 2010 RICO indictments hit, law enforcement made it sound like the war between 38th Street and the Pueblo Bishop Bloods was finally over. More than 70 suspects were swept up. Federal prosecutors said they had dismantled a violent network that had ruled Pueblo del Rio for decades, but in reality, the streets didn't quiet down for long. After the LA Times expose on the raids, LAPD's Southeast Division launched Operation Blockbuster, a targeted push inside the Pueblo del Rio projects and surrounding corridors of Vernon Avenue and Hooper. Dozens of raids turned up narcotics, weapons, and unregistered handguns tied to younger Pueblos trying to reclaim the block after older members were locked up. At the same time, 38th Street members were hit by their own wave of arrests under the Safe Neighborhoods Act. Federal affidavits linked the gang to cocaine distribution rings stretching from South LA into Huntington Park and Bell Gardens, with multiple defendants connected to longtime La MA intermediaries. While the headlines made it sound like justice was winning, detectives quietly admitted something else. Each takedown created a vacuum, and the vacuum drew new soldiers. By 2015, new generations were claiming the same colors, the same corners, but operating differently. Less structure, more chaos. 38th Street members were now feuding internally as well as externally, branching into smaller factions that still carried the original name but worked under no central authority. In Pueblo del Rio, younger bloods were running live streams and social posts bragging about their turf.
Oh, yeah. So, my nigga, trying to get in, my nigga on the hood. On my Pueblo niggas. Oh, blood. Yeah, all that. Yeah. Some Pueblo. Yeah, look at the little Pueblo. Look at the Pueblo Mexican. Oh, bitch.
Turning what used to be whispered street politics into viral content. The old guard behind bars was still calling shots in limited ways. Coded phone calls, prison kites, messages passed through girlfriends. But the streets were no longer waiting for permission. But the energy was the same, inherited beef, kept alive by memory and identity. Today, the Pueblo Bishop Bloods remain deeply rooted in the Pueblo del Rio projects, one of the last major blood strongholds south of downtown Los Angeles. The neighborhood looks different. Rebuilt units, new surveillance cameras, outreach programs, but the history lingers. 38th Street, once considered a unified East Side powerhouse, has fractured into microsets that still operate across Central Avenue, Vernon, and Hooper, maintaining the reputation they built nearly a century ago. Even after countless injunctions, arrests, and RICO cases, both groups still appear in LAPD gang intelligence bulletins. The paperwork changes, the names change, but the file numbers stay the same. The feud between 38th Street and the Pueblo Bishop Bloods became something bigger than the men who started it. It's a timeline written in police reports and court records, proof of how deep Los Angeles' gang rivalries run and how hard they are to erase. Peace in Los Angeles is never total. It's just paused. Surface, small busts, parole violations, neighborhood shootings that trace back to the same two names. The younger homies might not even remember the original spark, but they inherit the tension anyway. That's the curse of legacy beef. It outlives the people who lit it. That's the full breakdown. I would ask you to please like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell for notifications. More stories coming soon. Until then, watch your step and respect the streets.